All
Hello,
right, there we go.
everyone. This is Jennifer, and I'm coming to you live with an interesting guest that I have today. And we all have heard about leadership, what kind of leadership works, what you should do for leadership, how to engage with leaders. But how many of us have actually heard of fired leadership? It's interesting to actually hear about fired leadership because it's not a concept that is very well heard of and definitely not sought after. But we're here today to talk to somebody who was actually hired for a job and then got fired for exactly the job that he was hired for. And this has been his particular journey of not actually experiencing it just once, but a couple of times where he actually was hired for something and then got fired for actually doing the job that he was hired to do. So he's now started something of a movement, I may call it, which is called the fired leadership approach. And we're here today to talk to Paul McCarthy, a gentleman I find quite fascinating, who's here as a disruptor, a person who disrupts status quo. And those are the kind of people that I love to know about. So I got inquisitive and thought it'll be really cool to have Paul join us today to have a chat with us as to what exactly happened and does leadership really have to conform to the norm? So we're here to get some information from Paul as to how he perceives leadership and why the hell did he get fired from a position in leadership anyway? So welcome to the call, Paul. Thanks for joining us.
Jennifer, thank you. It's really, really nice to be here. I would state it was 4 times that I actually was fired. So
you do it in style, huh?
4 times. And, you know, whilst the majority of your listeners, as well as people in the world would, when they got fired, they would find it was a taboo subject. It was something that they wanted to push under the stairs, and you know they were embarrassed about it, and they would, you know, they'd probably go to a bookstore, get a self-help book, and massage their resume and move on. You know, but for me, I didn't do that. I had an overwhelming quest that drove me to understand more about this whole subject and why I was fired, and it's been such a revelation, and everything I've been doing since. I'm sure we'll get stuck into this in conversation, but yeah, pleased to be here and actually celebrate the fact that I've been fired as an executive leader 4 times in North America.
Great. So the question here, the next question I would like to ask is, Paul, what do you think actually got people to fire you in the first place? I mean, were you not performing? Were you not being a great leader? Were you a person who was totally of a different mindset to what management was? What was it that actually got you fired? And was it, for the 4 times that you did get fired, was it all the same reasons?
Yeah, it's often what a lot of people ask me initially when I speak with them, because we have this perception that if you're fired, that you must have done something wrong, that you either stole from the cookie jar, or stole too many post-it notes when we were in offices, or you weren't competent, you didn't do your job very well, and people didn't like you. And in all of my cases, that wasn't the case at all. Actually, I was fired for the qualities that I was actually hired for. And so I was asked to come in to help grow businesses where the approach that they wanted was someone to challenge the status quo, where they wanted someone to disrupt the current thinking. They wanted someone to provide dissenting perspectives. They wanted people to not play the political game. And I went through, and I say this on other podcasts that I've been on and interviews I've been on, I went through between 6 and 9 interviews on average in each role, which I would later find out in my research along what I'm doing is a very lengthy, expensive, time-consuming process, right? And we have another pandemic approaching us about the ineffectiveness of leadership identification, recruitment, onboarding, and development. But that we'll get into that. But I would I would be asked to demonstrate these qualities throughout the recruitment process. And I did. I would then join the organization. And as soon as I started to display these qualities, I would get my card marked. I would get, blacklisted, or I would get uninvited to the meeting, or there would be a meeting before the meeting and I wasn't invited to it, or there'd be a post meeting and I wasn't invited to it. And I started to become seen as this kind of pariah. And a pariah because I was demonstrating the qualities that I was asked to. And I realized quite quickly that I was stepping on what I would later call ego-based leadership landmines. And I wouldn't know it at the time, but I was unveiling increasing hypocrisy in modern day leadership, dysfunction, toxicity, politics. And I was, as part of my role as a leader and a consultant, my job is also to stay on top of the trends in terms of the future of leadership. And I've designed, developed, and delivered lots of leadership development programs for C-suite, board, management, emerging leaders. And I started to notice something, because rather than be that guy that just went and got the book to massage my resume, I got really curious about why I'd been fired. And I started to realize that the way that we're developing leaders, we're missing certain qualities in the way we develop them. And I started this crazy idea. You spoke off stage, backstage, about being inquisitive. I started getting really inquisitive about why I'd been fired, and also whether these qualities that I'd been fired for were missing from the way that we develop future leaders. And I found that they are. And so fired leadership was born, and fired leadership represents the 5 qualities that I was fired for. And again, we can go into this, but in a nutshell, fresh thinking, inquisitive nature, real and accountable, expressive and challenging, and direct and transparent. These were qualities that I was hired for, but they weren't called that in the recruitment process. And then I displayed them in my role as a leader. And unbeknownst to me, I would then uncover what I call the belly of the beast, and the fact that modern day leadership isn't working. The way that we lead is ineffective. The investment we make in leadership development is not bringing a return on investment. And even bigger than this, Jennifer, very few of us want to talk about this.
Oh, definitely. I know that for a fact, because how many times are people afraid to actually challenge status quo? I mean,
immensely.
It's not only in the area of leadership; it's across everything. But you are the leadership guru, so I know you don't like to be called that, but what the heck?
That's true.
Give it a shot anyway. And it's actually true. It actually is people conforming to the norming to actually be recognized as something that fits in. And even if people have been aware that this is not working, not many will declare that it's not working because they don't want to rock the boat within the organizations. And you see that happening all the time. So, I mean, I've had people who have said, why should we bother? We're just taking our paycheck and going home. Why should we even be concerned about this? And that's not how an organization should be actually operating. And I've seen that time and time again. So coming back to you and your approach, is your approach, so if you can give me the acronym of FIRED once again, so that we can actually talk about those. And probably I'd like to question those and see how it actually works out.
Fresh thinking.
Fresh thinking.
Inquisitive nature, real and accountable, expressive and challenging, and direct and transparent.
I love it.
So
we love it. So let's go with the first one, Paul.
Yeah. Well, fresh thinking, and this is probably going to be controversial or call for my head on a stick somewhere by the the leadership community, the learning and development community, but I don't care because it's accurate. And we assume that innovation, you just become innovative, right? And if you Google innovation on Google, you'll have millions of hits. But I'm a firm believer that your ability to be innovative or to drive innovation is based upon your ability to disrupt. And in order to be disruptive, you have to have the conditions in an organization to be able to think and dare to think and act differently. And that's what fresh thinking is. Fresh thinking is coming into a meeting and saying, and listening to, respectfully, professionally, courtesy, all that great stuff that we operate with civility. It is when someone presents an idea that is outdated, doesn't work, but they're the most senior person in the room. What tends to happen is everybody else conforms to the norm. The fresh thinker comes in and says, what's right for the organization? What's right for your ability as an organization to maintain its competitive advantage over its peers? Not what's right for your ego as a leader, because you want your idea to be the best one. And we created this culture, Jennifer, where we don't encourage people to be fresh thinkers, right? We bring them into an established system which is broken. We basically ask them to generate new ideas, but only within these parameters. Because the idea of disruptive thinking doesn't have any boundaries.
It doesn't have any parameters whatsoever.
No. And it's fueled, its engine room is the ability to be fresh thinker.
Absolutely.
And that means, thinking without boundaries, thinking without rule books, thinking without a timesheet code, thinking without we can't do that because what happens if we do this? And it's two very subtle mindset shifts that our modern day approach to leadership does not encourage. In fact, it actively discourages. And that moves into the second one, which is inquisitive nature. A study by Francesca Gino, who's a growing influencer in rebellious leadership herself. She's written a great book called Rebel Talent. She's a Harvard professor, and she studied, I think, 520 chief learning officers. And she wrote in an HBR business, it was called the Business Case for Curiosity, where she included some of her statistics and findings. And the chief learning officers that she surveyed actively discouraged leaders from being curious. Now, inquisitive nature is a similar quality to curiosity. But there are some subtle differences that I go into in my first of 3 books on this whole subject of fired leadership. But the chief learning officer said they actively discourage inquisitiveness, curiosity, because it's too expensive for the organization. So think about that. We want leaders to take us into the new world and disrupt and be the future. But we're still saying by doing so, it costs too much money. And so you have to fit your curiosity into a box with a timeline. And so one of the things that inquisitive nature's that quality is, it's that constant, asking why. Like, why do we do this? That irritant, that when everybody's zigging, you're zagging because you're really curious about something. And if you look at all of the major, historical moments in history in terms of innovation, they've all come from people just not conforming to the norm.
Status quo.
Exactly. And going against it because they have something that's driving them forward. And so the inquisitive nature is someone that stands out in an organization very clearly because they are interested in what's driving these conversations, underpinning these conversations. And they might seem like they're reckless to the outsider, but the inquisitive nature is driven by a sense of higher purpose as well. In fact, that's why fired leaders join your organization, because they stand for something and they're driven by what your purpose is because it aligns to their purpose. And again, research shows us in the future, leaders are going to be recruited and retained in your organization if their purpose aligns with the organization's. And if it doesn't, they're gonna vote with their feet. So that's the inquisitive. Real and accountable is we see, and you've seen it with clients and you've seen it in your own leadership journey, I'm sure, when you see like these one-page laminate menus with words like transparency and authenticity and integrity. How much of it
is just on the wall and never ever used or actually
absolutely
adhered to?
You're right. 100%, Jennifer, because they're not worth the paper they're written on. And I've been the consultant that's developed them for leadership teams, knowing that as soon as I've finished and the ink dries, and I've got my invoice settled, that they're not going to practice what they preach from this laminate menu. So I turn up the same with you as I turn up with a CEO, as the same I turn up with a janitor, to someone I meet on the street who's homeless. And that thread of continuity, of authenticity, drives throughout what I am, right? In fact, just a quick anecdotal story. When I started this venture of writing the first book, one of the reasons, so I was asked by a really good friend of mine, Kerry, in a coffee shop, why are you writing this book? Why do you think you've been fired that's led to you writing this first of 3 books? And my answer was, because I practice what I preach.
Hell yeah.
Now, I'm real, and that means to me, I don't have a personality that I leave at the door when I turn up to the office, right? And I'd
like
that's
to
key.
talk about that, Paul, a bit.
Yeah.
In the way that I have seen how organizations or corporations or any sort of company actually operates is they've got this funny idea. I think it has been we've been entrained into that way of thinking, is that at home you're going to be different, and in the office you've got to be different. But the weirdest thing is this: you're one person. Why would you have double standards in the first place? And it becomes so tiring that you have to be something somewhere and be something somewhere else. So there's no continuity there. So what if we were to actually fuel our authenticity to show up the way that we are, anywhere that we are, as you mentioned earlier, whether you're talking to a janitor or you're talking to a leader or you're talking to an executive secretary or anyone. Be who you are authentically and unapologetically.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the one of the he's a leading thinker in the space of self-managing organizations and future organizational structures, a guy called Frederick Laloux. He's actually written a book called Reinventing Organizations. And one of the central premises behind the idea that we show up as who we are is in the organization of the future is that we don't wear masks. And I don't mean the COVID masks that we've been used to wearing for the last 18 months. I mean that we are who we are when we're at home, we come into the office. Now, there's obviously, there's a polarity of this, because we're not saying that you turn up and let's say you're getting divorced or someone's died in your family. We're not talking about sharing everything. Right? I think this is where a lot of scholars and practitioners get confused. They think that we mean by being real, that means we have to show every single wart that we have, every single problem. That's not what we mean at all.
That's not that at all. You're right. No, I'm talking about the way that we think. Okay, and the way that we are within ourselves. I'm not talking about the people at home or the people in the office. It's about how congruent are we in our own relationship with ourselves that actually transmits in every area of our life, be it at home or at work. It's consistent. It's not that we have to, have a facade, so to speak, of this is who I have to be and this is who I have to be. And I think most of humanity is actually operating like that. It's ridiculous. It takes too much of energy.
You're right. And one of as part of doing some research for the first book, I've done a wealth of peer-reviewed research, and I've reviewed leadership development programs, I've reviewed onboarding programs that leaders that they go through, and we very seldom provide any space for modules on self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-development as leaders, because we assume, rightly or wrongly, I think it's wrongly, but we assume that sort of stuff is soft and fluffy.
Exactly.
Right. We still think that, even though there are efforts underway in organizations to transfer the mindset. But I envisage a future where leaders are, when they're onboarded and they're developed, that they spend a lot more time up front doing that inner work and that work that really is foundational for who they are as humans. Because, I didn't mention this about the five fired qualities, but they're not just qualities for the future leadership. they're qualities, I believe, for being a good human.
Exactly.
And so
and there should be
I
no
take this
disparity.
beyond.
There should be no
No.
disparity. If you're a good human being, you're a freaking good leader. Where did we separate that? Where do we alienate ourselves from actually, and whatever you're talking about as fluff, that's something that I work on for people and with people, because they're so subtle and the underlying energies that actually get people stuck and not actually being authentic within themselves. Because if you're not authentic, you can't be aware. And if you're not aware, you can't change anything.
And to your point, around the 5 qualities, this is almost a good segue to the next one, which is expressive and challenging, right? Because expressive, I call them the expressives or the challengers. These people with this quality are leaders who are congruent, right? So they say what they see, and they mean what they say what they mean, and they basically they do it in a respectful, polite way, of course, but they vocalize what a lot of people are thinking internally, but they're either complacent, complicit, or they're fearful, quite frankly, of the organizational culture that's been generated, which, by the way, they're part of, but they don't know they can change it, right? So the fired leader comes in because they're foundational and they're grounded in that foundational sense of being as a human. They are congruent with the way they express themselves. And this is what some of the misinterpretation is of fired leaders, because you think fired leaders, they must have done something wrong, as I mentioned earlier. They must be combative. They're a disruptor. So they must be throwing hand grenades in the middle of the room to evoke change. No, they're using a Trojan horse concept. They're using the language of the organization. They're doing it in a respectful way, but they are moving the organization along. They're nudging it along by being challenging, right? So they don't just accept the surface level answer that comes along. They probe deeper, right? And then that is fused with the last quality, which is direct and transparent. They never play the political game. They never even take part in it. In fact, they refuse to, because they know that playing the game leads to toxicity. It leads to, financially, there are so many repercussions for an organization. And also there's non-financial costs, which are the impact to your stress levels, the impact to your mental health, your foundational being. And so they're direct in how they communicate, and they're clear. They're very clear. And I did some research, again, as part of the first book. I think it was the University of Nebraska said that, we have, I can't remember the statistic, but it's something like 55 million meetings across North America every day. And 50% of those meetings, Jennifer, are unproductive. They don't need to happen. So let's put the financial cost of those meetings aside for one moment. 50% of meetings are unproductive. And by the way, the average executive spends 22 years in meetings. Now, 11 years of those meetings don't need to take place. The fired leader with the direct and transparent quality comes in and gets straight to the point in a meeting. Why are we having this meeting? What's the objective? What's the value going to be? If we don't need to have it, why are we having it? And Elon Musk, whether you love him or hate him or are indifferent to him, he's got a very famous quote that says, if you're not adding any value to a meeting, leave it. Just leave it.
Yeah. So now, as you talk, I'm actually looking at, if you were to come in to any organization with the fired leader approach, I could see many organizations cringing and wondering, is it safe to have this kind of guy with us? That's number one. Number two, and I talk about it openly because it's actually a fact. It's no need to mollycoddle anymore, because we've got to call things for what they are, because that's the only way I believe that things are going to shift and move forward. Okay. So you have people who like, he's not going to be good for the morale. He's going to actually come and disrupt everyone. We've been running the organizations well so far. But on the other hand, we do require a person who's actually going to come in with new ideas. But what repercussions is it going to have on the people? And are they going to actually fall into the spray? So now, for those kind of people, I want you to share with us and our audience, how would you approach all these kind of things? And they will not show up in your face, by the way. These all hidden subtleties that go on under the carpet that will blow up. Those are one of the reasons why you were fired, right? In 4 different companies. For 4 different companies. It was because they hired you to actually be this person. And then the repercussions of, oh my God, exactly what I said before. So now going forward, with any organization, now you are the CEO for your own company and you're a future thought leader. You're a person who is looking at how will work actually be in the future? How will companies operate in the future? Which is absolutely phenomenal. And I love the idea. So any organization right now that is well organized and is wanting to have a new thought leader approach, how do you address these particular subtleties, which they will not talk about, by the way, because they never do. Yet they will ask you to do something to help them to make the organization and the people within the organization more proactive, more performance-based. Their performances have to improve. So how do you address those subtleties, Paul, with organizations? What sort of questions do you ask a client who's asked you to come in short, and say, Paul, we'd like you to actually change some things around? How do you address that?
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned earlier the grenade versus the Trojan horse metaphor. I'll be completely transparent because I am a fired human, right? So in complete transparency, and those that have followed me on my journey know what I'm about to say, and they know the evolution I've gone through and still go through on the daily basis. Trust me, it's painful. It's a very painful process to evolve and look at yourself in the mirror and realize, you've got a lot more to go as a human. We never get there, right? But we're always
on that journey, Paul. That's the journey.
That is the journey.
It's not a bloody destination at all.
I know. I think it was John Lennon, the Beatles, who said, life is what happens when you're busy making plans. So given that context, now I've just started that answer to address your question there. About 4 years ago, when I started this journey, I wanted to be the guy that threw the grenade in the middle of the room. I
remember actually talking to you. I think it was right about a year back.
Yeah.
And I heard you speak, and I said, possibly not at this time. And you remember, you remember that I went absolutely silent.
I do.
And then just day before yesterday, I said, Paul, it's time now. It's weird because I haven't been following you in what it is you're doing, but I had the sense. Now was the time.
Yeah, that's very intuitive of you.
Yeah.
Because I would say right up until about 8 or 9 months ago, I still wanted to be the guy who threw the grenade in the room, and it wasn't from a place of anger. So I want to just clarify for any listeners and anyone I talk to in the past or future, I'm not angry having been fired. As I said at the beginning, I celebrate it, but my deep sense of, I know what's coming, in the sense, and I'm not predicting, and I'm not some sort of person that can see the future.
Why aren't you? Hang on a second. Yes, you are. Okay. Well, but the one thing that, if I could just take a second there, is like when you were a couple of months back considering yourself as this grenade in the room, what made you actually sense that you were actually being the grenade in the room? Because I'm getting something, and I'd like to clarify that. You didn't find anything wrong, and you did not find anything wrong with you to actually show up as you. But what you were experiencing is like, this has got to damn well change now.
Yeah.
And that is the grenade energy there.
Well, I think what happened was I tapped more into my empathy and compassion. And so as a human, because I start, the whole reason I'm doing this is that future leaders that aren't even born yet never have to have these conversations in the workplace. right? About toxic cultures, organizational politics, leadership dysfunction, leadership apathy, the waste of money that we spend $400 billion a year on leadership development. The return on investment of that is abysmal, and leaders don't get what they want to learn. They leave your organization either voluntarily or involuntarily. That is a rising pandemic, in my opinion. I don't want the future to experience that. So I started to tap more into the empathy and compassion piece, right? Whereas before I was saying, almost like wanting to shake the organization to say, you need to listen to this, right? Because I see, like using the classic S curve of disruption. You've got at the bottom, you've got the laggards, right? At the top, you've got the early adopters, and somewhere in the middle, you've got the mainstream. And I just wanted to blow it all up and kind of like, go in straight at the mainstream and the laggards and say, can't you just open your eyes? Because I can join the dots and I can see what's coming in the sense of the trends. But there was an energy around me, right? So the energy around me was, I need to put myself into the position of the mainstream and the laggards in a better way, because I do know what it's like to work in a toxic environment as a leader, but I've never been complacent to it. I've never accepted it. You could say that's probably one reason why I was fired too, because I didn't play the game, because I don't believe that we need to play the game. I think we can choose the game. In fact, it doesn't even need to be a game. And so the shift in me, which I think you're not the only person to observe that, there's been a number of others, has been now to say, I'm going to meet the organization and the leadership cadre where they are, right where they are now. So this is the Trojan horse concept. And this is, we talked backstage about some of the other areas that I'm doing, not just fired leadership, which has evolved into these other practices that I'm doing. And to answer your original question is, how would I come into an organization and have this conversation? I wanted to give you that shift in me personally first, because the other parts of my practice now revolve around how to work with an organization where it is philosophically, culturally, ideologically, from a position of how do we build on what you've got? So I'm passionate about, before I even introduce a counterintuitive approach to the future of leadership and fired leadership, I'm passionate about helping organizations to create the conditions so that they can have these painful conversations in a way that matters. Now, will it be possible in all organizations? I'm a realist, I'm a practical person, but I'm also utopic. I don't think it's possible in all organizations, but I do want to have the conversations that we want to bring out from the stairs, underneath the stairs, right? Will everybody do that? No, but so I've changed my tact in a way, Jennifer, because I want people to tell me where they're at. And just like in my regular consulting, if I go in to do an org development piece or a transformation, I have to have some check of where the organization is in terms of maturity, appetite. And so I baked that into my approach in terms of, in my first book, I give away an end-to-end roadmap, because I want my reader and my target client to actually be able to take this stuff themselves and never need me. Right? And one of the first sets of activities in stage 1 of that roadmap is to actually measure your readiness and your appetite. Right? So have the conversations. And if you get to a point where at this point you're saying, it's not for us at this time, that's fine. Chart down why, and then revisit it. Just like the example of you and me on the podcast, you sensed about a year ago that it might not be the right time to have me on. And that was your decision, and it was respected and valid, and it was accurate. So just in the same way that we've now re-engaged with an organization, it can revisit and say, 6 months ago, we felt that we didn't have the appetite.
Exactly.
Now we do. And what I've done in the first book is lay out what the steps are that they can take as an organization once they are ready. So go like a go, no go stage gate process, right? It's like Monopoly, do not pass go unless you've got this, right? And I don't want to enforce my ideas onto people. I know that there's a market that are really going to adopt this, and they're more the early adopters, right? So they're the markets that they don't really care about tried and tested approaches, which, by the way, have never really worked anyway. They want to have the conversations because they're starting new organizations, and they want to start them right with the right blueprint.
Which is correct. Now, whatever you're saying makes total sense, but people have got to get that whatever it is that they tried to work on before the so-called pandemic and corona, whatever, truly is not working anymore. So when we are trying to create anything new per se, and if we are going to go back to our past reference points, we are going to initiate exactly the same thing that we want to change, which is totally ridiculous. So the adoption of a new way of thinking, having the space to actually create that as a possibility for management or for team members, and allowing people to speak up. Why do people imagine that someone who is on a junior level will not have a brilliant idea? I just find that totally ridiculous, because I've had experiences in my own company where we were doing some sort of a charity event for a special needs school, and we were going to sponsor it. And we had everything in place, the corporate structure. We have to have the flyers and, getting ready from the corporate perspective. And then we had this meeting, we had all the flyers, all the stage and everything set up. And then we were just having our last, couple of questions that we had for one another. And then walks in my driver. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't ask you for any suggestions." And he asked me a very simple question. He says, "Ma'am, is this event for children?" I said, "Yes." And then the next question he asked me was, "Ma'am, do we have any games?" And all of us went, "My God, it's a children's event and we haven't got anything." And we all went as a team to get things sorted out, to create games. And those are the best things that actually work. No one was looking at our framework and our stand. Nobody was. But the point I'm trying to make here is, how many of us do really ask of suggestions of people who are working with us, and not only leaders? And why can't everyone in an organization be actually treated and encouraged and engaged and empowered to be a leader? Is my question.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as you were saying, your example, my mind went to one of my case studies that I referenced in my book. I believe her name is Melody Dobson, and she was the joint CEO of an asset management firm, I believe, called Ariel Investments. And one of her mantras, and she's quite a prolific figure in her area. One of her mantras is that she wants people to challenge her. She wants people to come up with new ideas, and she expects it in the sense of not to be rank driven. So it doesn't matter what you are in the company. She mandates that you come to the table with an idea or something to challenge with. And I think there's another organization. I think it's another finance organization. Is it Ray Dalio? One of the financial gurus in the world. He basically, and the irony is not lost on me what I'm about to say, he fires people who don't challenge, right?
Which is great,
So,
I think.
Which is fantastic. So to your question around, is it possible to create this mosaic, this environment where equity of access is the case? I firmly believe it. But what needs to happen first is people need to be safe. But I'm not gonna drone on about the concept of psychological safety. I do believe that it's valid, but it's one of these things. It's like the word guru. It's become, everybody's using it these days. And for me, at the core of psychological safety, which is at the core of the conversation we're having now on this segment, is trust. So if I don't trust you as my leadership team member, then why am I going to work with you openly? You talked about the subtleties of leadership, right?
Absolutely.
the trust is the glue that binds us together as a leadership team. If I don't think you've got my back because you want that role over me, that new promotion, right? Then why am I going to be inclusive? Why am I going to be open? Why am I going to be transparent with you? Because you're just going to use that information against me. And that speaks to the fact that our organizational structures need to shift. You know, I mentioned earlier about Frederick Laloux and self-managed organizations. At the heart of self-managed organizations, people are driven by this sense of evolutionary purpose. They have a fundamental individual sense of integrity, and they have a wholeness, right? So if your leadership team operate with those three premises alone, then your chances of being much more effective as an organization intensify. So yeah, I think for me, it's about welcoming all different viewpoints to the table and not doing it from a position of hierarchy or judgment, but actually creating the conditions for people to have different viewpoints and not have those viewpoints judged. And when you co-create a solution, you empower people. And guess what? When you empower them, you make them more productive. And then guess what? When you make them more productive, the chances of them being retained in your organization are also higher.
Yeah, and they actually truly show up as the ambassadors of the organization. And empowered at that too. So, I mean, from a personal perspective, I've never ever been in any organization when I was an employee, which I gave up, I think, around about 30 years back, was to ever consider myself as an employee. I never ever had that feeling, or because I'm being the way that I am, I've always been like this across everywhere I worked. And maybe in one organization, I had a guy who was my boss who really didn't like the way that I showed up because I had a response to every question that he asked. And he really used to get, peeved at that. And then he used to try and figure out a way of how to make my life miserable every week when he used to visit from another place, right? And he would say, I don't like this, and I don't like this. And I said, till I came to a point and I said, okay, fine. Okay, I understand. I'll try and do better. Till I sensed that he was just wanting to rile me up for some reason or the other. So the last time he came and actually asked me a question, or rather told me, I don't like the way you're doing this, I just stopped in my tracks and said, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this, and I've tried this. Now, you being my immediate line manager, would you tell me a better way of doing it, please? Because God knows I've tried everything, but you don't seem to be pleased, right? So we've got to actually inculcate within the people that we are working with, i.e. people whom we do consider juniors, to be able to open up and not shut up. We cannot shut up anymore because it's not working. And yes, many people who are leadership gurus would totally disagree to what I'm saying, but I truly believe that if you want every member of your team, be it from the upper ranks to the lower ranks, to actually be the voice of your organization, you've got to allow them to be great within the organization so they can actually speak about the organization and be the true ambassadors. And I think what you're doing is phenomenal. You're doing a great job, a wonderful job. I have one thing that I'd like to ask you before you start saying anything else is, I'd like you to give our audience 5 different things that they can start looking at within the organizations that they're in. They could be the leaders, they could be people who are mid-rank or lower. What are the things that they need to be aware of and recognize so that they can actually step in and step up to truly changing how things are operating within their company? Because I think every person has, and it doesn't have to be that people have to go and say, oh, my name is Jennifer and I said this. No, something that could be an anonymous thing where suggestions are made,
Mm.
where people can actually voice their opinion without being fired for it.
Well, Jennifer, I envisage a future world in organizations as well as leadership where instead of fearing that you'll be fired, you're embraced for the qualities that would get you fired. So that's my end goal, right? So I want to reframe the narrative on why we fire leaders for these qualities, but I also want to shake up the industry of leadership to have the conversation that it's not been having, because we keep, Einstein. What did Einstein say? The definition of insanity is
doing the same thing over
Yeah,
and over again, expect a different result.
exactly. And that's what I think our modern day approach to leadership is. Now, we are not even appreciating what millennial leaders or those that come after them will want in terms of the future. So that's my kind of, bigger picture here. But in terms of, and I appreciate what I'm about to say, people might kind of be fearful of. Some of them might be at different stages in their career and their self-awareness, their ability to take risks, and their perception of their own courage. So I want to caveat what I'm about to say by the fact that I've been in your shoes, right? And my journey has led me where it's led me. But I think the first thing is to know what you stand for, your sense of purpose. What do you individually stand for? And that is such a bedrock for me. It's a foundational. It's actually what are you prepared? Like, what's your voice?
Who are you? It's actually
who are you? Who are you, right? What are you prepared to stand up for, right? And I'm not judging humans at all, but if you don't know that, and a lot of us just go through life coasting, and we never really ask these conversations, these topics of ourselves. But I would say the first thing for me is to get grounded on what your purpose is. The second one, I've written the words down here, so I'm looking at my notebook. The second is to kind of, because you obviously didn't give me any script, and I like your approach. So you asked me a question, and I'm a processor in real time anyway. So I was like, as soon as you asked me that, I'm starting to think of things. The second one is politics. Let me give you just a little bit of a background to this. About 30 or 40 documents I reviewed as part of my first book in the area of politics. And every single one of them either started or ended by saying, it's a shame we have to play the political game when we have such disdain for it. Now, I don't foresee a situation in the future where we will have to keep playing the political game. We are restructuring the way that we work. 25 years ago, we hadn't had the largest global human capital experiment, which is COVID, right? So we didn't have this concept of work remotely, because when you wanted to work remotely, you weren't trusted because you weren't in front of the organization. So your line manager that you referenced, I bet you 25 years ago, if you said, I'm going to work 3 days a week from home, they wouldn't have liked that, right? You would have been fired. You would have been fired. I don't know what you're doing. I don't trust, so ultimately it comes down to trust, which comes down to fear. I'm fearful of something, so I don't trust you. So I come back to politics, because politics is the result of fear and lack of trust and complacency and toxicity and dysfunction, right? So decide what role you want to play in politics. You're either passively condoning it, or you're proactively supporting it, or you're somewhere in the middle. So what politics is in every, your listener will know, in every organization, politics manifests itself differently, but the outcome is still the same. So the future is a world where politics will not be in place. Totally. Or if it is, well, I'm a utopic thinker, right? So I know that there will be conversations about whether that's accurate, but I also know that the future doesn't have a playbook yet. And we get to decide what that future looks like.
I have one thing though. So why would we assume that politics will still be there out in the future? Because if we have got anything to do with it, you and me, and some others like us, it will be totally eradicated, simply because I truly believe that politics creates confusion within the organization, which interrupts the unified approach that we can have
Hmm.
internally that truly creates how people perceive us as an organization externally.
Yeah.
I really do not think it has any value um, for within the organization. If anyone is playing politics, they shouldn't be in the organization simply because they are not willing to actually be part of what it is the vision and the mission of the company is in the first place.
Mm.
They will be uncomfortable.
So you're right in theory. However, if people like you and me and others cannot get people to the table to have the conversation,
Mm,
that is what I believe will mean that politics is still in the future.
mm,
If we fail in our mission to create the conditions for people to come to the table and have that open dialogue,
mm.
that then continues the breeding ground for politics. So if we're able to bring the elephant out into the middle of the room and talk about it, and I even say, one of the things I was going to say as one of my next tangible things that you asked me for listeners is almost like what I call name what you see moments. And I've
Yes,
written about this in the Guru Guide with Anton and Vidusha. But I find that a really useful technique because some people have tried it so far in organizations that I won't name for obvious reasons, but they have started to see benefits. And name what you see moments are all centered around honesty
yeah.
and honesty about politics. So that's the third thing, having honest based conversations using a technique like name what you see. And what that basically is to anyone listening is if you've got a leadership team, management team, or a project based team, you each name what you see in terms of the politics or dysfunction or toxicity. Now, again, don't try this at home, kids, if your organization doesn't have trust at the core, right? If you have an untrusting environment, this exercise is not going to work. So you have to have that conversation first. But name what you see moments are, well, hey, Jennifer, what I'm seeing this week in you is X, right? And then it's a case of saying, Paul, I'm seeing this in you. Okay, how do we then, as a team, if there's more than us, select one or two to focus on for the week, and then make sure individually and collectively we're working towards resolving whatever that is.
I have
Now,
one thing over here. I'm sorry to interfere, Paul, but if we were to say to people that whatever it is that is being done does not necessarily suggest that you are wrong as a person, okay? Because it's an act that is being done. It does not, it's not you. You see, those are the kind of things I think people need to inculcate within organizations, because I don't think any organization right now is looking to empower the individuals. No one is
yeah,
empowering individuals, and that is what I do. Um, because unless you don't empower people to see where it is that they're operating from, you will always be faced with all these challenging things where they're trying to resort to something that's a comfort zone, where they will be conforming and trying to perform by conforming. No one is ever going to show up, and there's going to be no disruption. So it actually has to be initiated from the onset that, okay, fine, so and so person, so and so person, so and so person, you need to actually go and let's have a mentorship program, for these people. And that's what I'm doing right now. And my goodness, is it creating a wave in how people are showing up at work, in their businesses. I do that for CEOs. And it's really interesting that most of the time we're not even aware as to what the hell is going on. We just have no clue. We're just going on and on and on and on with the same frigging status quo. And it is totally making our lives miserable. And then we're making other people's lives miserable because we as leaders think that we have to have all the answers, which is totally
well,
not the case.
and to be controversial, and again, this might have my head on a spike by the leadership and learning development community, but great leaders don't always have all the answers. And so
ridiculous. Then
being,
what kind of recruitment are you doing if you as a leader have to have all the answers?
yeah, well, it's tantamount to draconian hierarchical based leadership, right? Which is what we know in the future will not be the case. But to your point you just made about, the act, not the person, right? That's really important. You made that, and one of the things I do in my work is not to say, let's say you're having a meeting with another, leadership person on our team, and you've excluded me in your silo-based behavior, right? And you're excluding me. I'm not saying that you're a bad person. I'm saying the act of silo-based leadership will lead to erosion of trust. Exactly. And let's focus on that act. So that is very important distinction, because at the moment, a lot of organizations, they take it personally, but this is where, I mentioned earlier about the future organization self-managed philosophy is about what is the evolutionary purpose. So if your purpose aligns to the organization's, then you've got that commonality, and it's what are we doing in our behaviors to further realize the purpose of the organization. And that's where we have to take emotions out of it, which, we talked about earlier about self-awareness modules in leadership development. I'm convinced, and I've reviewed a lot of onboarding programs and onboarding literature for leadership teams, and the majority of them focus on orientation. You get your IT credentials, your passwords, your HR stuff. They don't focus on actually helping to immerse you into the organizational culture. They don't focus on helping you navigate some of those challenges that you're going to experience. But what about if they did? That has that's exponentially shown that those organizations that do, they outperform their competitors. They have better retention rates, they have higher productivity, reduced morale, and they're a pleasure to be around as leaders.
Yeah, they have fun doing it. I don't understand.
And they have fun.
The leadership does not have to be something that you have to reprimand people. I think that's the old school of what I say goes, and you need to follow. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I truly believe that leaders can be created. Everyone has got something or the other that can be nurtured into becoming a leader in their own right. So you can have someone who's being a leader and does a brilliant job in preparing tea and coffee. You can be a leader of that. You have someone who could be a leader in photocopying or in the back office. And for us to even think that every role in an organization, the only important roles are that of leaders, is totally ridiculous, or the CEO, one word role. But I truly believe that what if you didn't have a receptionist? She's the face of the organization. Why can't we train her to be phenomenal in the way that she actually shows up and the way that she projects what the organization is all about? And why can't she be the leader?
And what you're saying, it's just sparked something in my mind that I've seen from the research, as well as something I write about. It's the future leader and the sense of not having titles. So, we unfortunately in the modern day organization, we stratify people by their leadership level, their title, and their remuneration is set according to that, and their sense of power and authority is deemed based upon what their level and their seniority is. But I've said to leadership teams in the last few years, imagine in the next 5 years from now, you're sitting around, whether it's a physical table or a table via Zoom or Microsoft Teams, right, or whatever it is, and you are all setting your remuneration together publicly, transparently. And 6, 7 out of 10 on average would say to me that they think I'm crazy. That will never happen.
That will never happen.
But it's happening right now, Jennifer, around the world in some of the largest self-managed organizational structures, the household names. If we were to talk like Patagonia, Gore-Tex, Bertzog, which is a healthcare firm, a provider out of Germany, I believe, or the Netherlands. There are some big players like the Haier Group out of China, largest manufacturing company of white goods in the world, right? There are some organizations right now that, ironically, and the irony is not lost on me and probably will not be lost on you, that a lot of these organizations are looked at as case studies in MBA programs or leadership programs. And yet the organizations these leaders then go back to erode or don't create the conditions for the best practices that they've just been learning from their programs.
Yeah,
right
because
there.
they're afraid to, and it's too time consuming and it's too expensive for the organization, but they really don't get this, that unless you don't engage to empower people and enable them to actually show up the way the organization will benefit from. Again, the whole concept of organizations must have one mission and one mission to actually, the vision and mission has to be so strong, not just written on the wall, but actually applied all the time.
Well, you're right. And I jokingly refer to this as what I call the water cooler paradox. And I'm doing some kind of speaking on that, as well as some other materials that I'm developing. But the water cooler paradox, Jennifer, is really, if you really want to understand the true state of the organizational culture and the leadership culture, and the take a pulse on the organization and how those values on that wall are being lived, then just be a fly on the water cooler wall, and you will really understand the conversations that happen. And I remember a client years ago where I was in there to do some leadership training, and ironically, we were there to help them as leaders become better at handling conflict. And we had a full room of 30, 40 people, and everybody was nodding along, and everything like that, and it was all great. And so from a facilitator's perspective, we were thinking we were delivering, over delivering what they wanted. And then they went out to the water cooler, and I just happened to be passing by and heard some of the conversations at the break, because that was where they checked their email, caught up with someone, had a cup of tea, whatever. And they completely had a different perspective of how the program was going, right? So I was sitting, I just passed by on my way to the washroom, and what a dent to the ego. They were saying, those facilitators, they're rubbish. They don't know what's going on. And so, but they're nodding along, because when you do the end of the workshop and you say, how did we do? And you get 10 out of 10. That's the complete paradox, right? What is that saying to you? That's saying to you the organizational culture does not allow them to be honest. So they think the facilitators suck and they're not that good, and they don't understand the nuances. I would like to be told that. I'd like the culture to say, this is what we want to learn. And in fact, just before you make your point there, what parts of my research I found was the majority of leaders have no say in what they get to learn as part of the leadership program. So it's no wonder these leaders were sitting there at the water cooler or whatever, saying there's no relevance to what we need to apply to our job, right? Because they didn't have a role in selecting what they learned.
Exactly. It's just shoved onto people. Like, okay, now go and do this.
Exactly.
Okay, now
and I was the facilitator that they had doing this. But if I'd known what they wanted, I could have structured the program to be much more applicable when they went back to their day-to-day job.
A lesson to be learned, Paul.
Yes, that was 20 years ago.
Yeah, before going into any organization, find out what exactly are they facing right now and what it is that they would like to change right now, and whether everyone on the team is willing to participate in that change. And if not, say hasta la vista.
Yes, and also the other point to that is, we've done a bunch of money putting leaders on courses and programs. They leave, but we don't actually measure the return on investment in terms that, for me, there's two things that lead to successful programs, right? In the sense of being embedded into the organization and the approach to leadership when they leave the course. One is, did it give them a skill? Did it enhance any of their skills, right? And the second, did it lead to sustainable behavior change? So what are they going to do differently when they leave? How are they going to apply that learning? And how are we going to measure that they've applied that learning? So what I found out, it was a shocking discovery, was that we don't engage leaders in asking them how they want that application of the learning to be measured. So we don't do that. So we don't include them in the design, the development, and the deployment of the programs. And we don't include them in the way that we measure the effectiveness of the programs that they've attended.
That's interesting. Okay, so now we're coming to the close of our conversation. Paul and I could talk to you for a very long time, but you had given us, I think, 3 points that the people can actually consider as a takeaway. What other 2 points would you like to leave our audience with in the way going forward?
Yeah, the second, the fourth and the fifth one I wrote here were persistence. So never give up. You know, like there's always a way to chip away at something, to move something forward. So you don't have to be like me in the sense of, you know, being that highly vocal leader who then gets fired because I'm essentially, I've been told I'm a leader ahead of my time in an organizational structure that is like the Titanic and slow to move, right? So persistence pays, and that's small things in whatever your control or zone of influence is, right? So just keep chipping away. You know, if anyone's seen The Shawshank Redemption, I don't know if you've seen that movie. Fantastic. One of my favorite movies. You know what he does over time, right? He chips away, but he has that calendar behind covering the wall that he chips away, and eventually over 15 years, I'm not saying it will take that long, but you know, he then escapes, and so he should, because he was, you know, wrongly accused and all this sort of stuff. So that's the first, there's the fourth point. And then the fifth point is really think of the bigger picture. So line back that purpose and what you stand for at the beginning to the bigger picture. And if you don't see a future with the organization, then why are you there? So think about that bigger picture, your own bigger picture, the organization's bigger picture, and whether you see that path unfolding. And, you know, again, it's, as I said earlier, you know, I've learned on my journey not to want to be the guy that throws the grenade in the room, right? So I might want to change the world, and I am, and I will, and we will, and we'll all change the world in our own way. But think about the bigger picture in the sense of how, use the language, meet people where they're at, and trying to put yourself in their shoes to see what their bigger picture is, and do so from a place of being selfless. No judgment, no ego, just what is the best thing for the organization.
Great advice, fantastic advice. So ladies and gentlemen, we were listening to Paul McCarthy, a gentleman who has, from his personal experience, been able to start a movement. I call it a movement, and
I love it.
It's really a movement to help people to get out of conforming to the status quo and actually truly desire to become the pro. Because I think all of us can be professionals, and how we go about doing it is going to be our own personal representation of how we show up in our own value system before we can actually share the value with anyone else. Paul has also written a book. Would you like to tell our listeners about your book?
I'd love to. I know that we could talk for hours.
We're going to share the link below so people can
get
the book.
It's in the process of being finalized right now, and it's been a labor of love, but it at the moment, the current title, unless I go with a different type of publisher, but the title for now, it's the working title, which is The Fired Leader, Reinventing the Future of Leadership. Wonderful. And it basically talks in a lot more depth about my story, but my story isn't the story. My story was the platform to start this movement.
The thing is that your story is similar to very many other people's story. Only thing that you have actually been brave enough to voice that.
Or stupid enough.
No? It's the stupids that actually make a difference.
Yeah. But thank you.
We may be considered stupid, but I guess it's the stupids that actually have got what it takes, and we call the weirdos. So the weirdos are the ones who actually look at a change being possible and actually create the change.
And I love that, because you know what, I'm in my journey over the last 4 years, what I've started to see is so many more authors and thought leaders come out of the woodwork. You know,
Exactly.
I call them fired leaders. You know, other people call them misfits. Other people call them rare breeds. Other people call them professional troublemakers. And I'm networking with a lot of these authors as well that have written books in those areas. But we're all part of this bigger picture. And I firmly believe we can shift the narrative. And that's what I'm doing it for.
Here we are all coming together to shift the narrative of how it is that the future of the workplace is going to be, and how we can all come together to create something greater. So having said that, Paul, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me and my audience. I truly believe that the work that you're doing is truly commendable. And I love the enthusiasm that I see in today's Paul. So keep up the great work. It's really wonderful to see you meeting people from a Trojan horse approach as opposed to the grenade. And I'm quite sure, by the way, a grenade is sometimes required also. So don't make yourself wrong. So possibly everywhere that you have made yourself wrong is actually where you're strong. So I would ask you to question that, look at that. And if you need any help, give me a call so I can help you with looking at all those different dimensions that are so amazing till we reveal what's really working for us and what's not working for us. So have a great evening, or whatever's left of it. And I will say hasta la vista, because it is now 10:30.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for staying up this late.
No. I was up till 3 o'clock in the morning, so no big deal.
Thank you. And platforms I love platforms like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for taking the time. Truly appreciate it. Okay. God bless. Bye.
Thank you.